welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you, or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the non-fiction author Naomi Klein.
We spoke to Naomi about the huge success of her debut, No Logo, the line between journalism and activism, and her latest book, Doppelganger.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Naomi, to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the show. Let's start with Doppelganger. You've described it as your most personal book, and you've said that it was never your intent to write the book. When did it become clear that you had to write it?
Well, I had just written it, I suppose, is what happened. It was a completely different writing process than my previous books, in that, I start the book with this sort of disclaimer that in my defense, it was never my intent to write the book, and no one asked me to, and several people strongly cautioned against it. And that is true, and very, very unlike what my process had been like for every book since No Logo, and there had been 8. There were 8 books before Doppelganger. In that, previously, I always had a plan to write a book, had a proposal, had an outline, had a book contract, had people waiting for me, and book catalogs that needed to be reprinted when I missed my deadline and things like that. With Doppelganger, I didn't tell anybody in publishing about the book until I had basically written the book. It was kind of like being 8 months pregnant and being like, by the way, I'm about to have a baby. Because I really was trying something new in terms of form and voice. And I wanted to make sure that I could back out if it didn't work. So it was entirely kind of self-driven in that way, which was really nice. I was only writing it because I wanted to write it. And it really was genuinely inconvenient because I had a job at a university where I did have a lot of demands. And I was always kind of sneaking away to write. And it was just a nice feeling as somebody who's been a professional writer for a quarter of a century, and kind of, when you're writing under a deadline, it's a little hard to disentangle what is you wanting to do something and what is a sense of duty, right? And with this book, it was just something that I just kept coming back to. And originally I was thinking about it as maybe a New Yorker essay, like that's something along the genre. Maybe it would be like a very long essay, like maybe it would be, close to 20,000 words. But then I just kept thinking of different ways that the figure of the double was a potential entry point into topics that I really wanted to explore. I think originally it was going to be a little bit lighter, like it was going to only be about personal branding and AI, and those types of doubles. But then when I guess the world started turning more fascist as I was writing the book, I became more aware that the figure of the double was often a way to explore the kind of fascist collective turn in a society, the way a whole society can have a double that flips. And when I started the book, I wasn't sort of aware of that tradition within doppelganger literature of using the figure of the double to explore fascism. So as things got more fascisty, it felt like, oh, okay, I need book length for this. This is beyond the sort of light threaded essay on a theme that I originally thought I was going to do. So the book does change tones, right? As it goes, it starts a little bit lighter and you're like, oh, maybe this will just be a fun romp. And then, I had in the back of my mind this Leonard Cohen song, like, You Want It Darker. It just kept getting more and more kind of heavy.
So we should say to listeners that the initial doppelganger that you grapple with in the book is Naomi Wolf, another public intellectual whose views are very different to yours, but whose name is sufficiently similar that people have confused you. You said that you kind of wrote this, without telling your people, your agent or your editor and stuff. What was the reaction when you delivered the manuscript to them?
It was interesting because, I did mention it to somebody fairly early on who was not anyone who I was working with at the time, and they were genuinely worried about it. Like they thought, like, just the concept of it seemed dangerous. Like, to me, to my reputation, like, you're too serious a writer to write something that sounds a little frivolous, like using this public confusion. And the truth about a book like this is that it's all in execution. It's all in form. You can't really explain it. It could go terribly wrong. So the real question is, did you pull it off or not? And so I decided that I wanted to work with a new editor and I wanted to work with a new agent on this book, in part because, for a variety of reasons that aren't, I'm not going to get into now, but I also thought that if I'm going to write in a more a more creative nonfiction form, as opposed to a more sort of straight ahead, very, very sort of fact heavy thesis argument, and in the way that I have in the past around shock doctrine and This Changes Everything, I wanted an editor that would bring out another side of me, like a more literary side, and I was looking for a new agent anyway. So I reached out to a friend's agent, Sue Halpern, who's a New Yorker writer and a friend of mine, and she introduced me to her agent, Kimberly Witherspoon, and at that point I had 100 pages to share, and she got it right away. And the thing that I really liked about Kim in our initial conversation was, she said the biggest danger in this book is catfight. The biggest danger is that people will keep trying to pull you over on the side of the road and make it about you and her when you want to talk about all these other themes. So, our job is going to be to keep that from happening. And so I thought, okay, this is great. I found my agent now, because she does understand that, and she isn't looking at it for like the gossip kind of potential. And then she just did her agency thing. And then once she sent it out and I was getting initial responses back, it was actually I kept the book secret, which is hard. Like, if a book goes to, the book had a sort of 3-round auction, and I think it had 9 publishers bidding on it. So at that point, I knew the book was working, or there wouldn't have been all these publishers who wanted it. But what was really hard was keeping it from getting, like, we kept it secret for 10 months after that, which is very rare in publishing. So yeah, after that happened, I only had a few more chapters to write, and I knew something was going well, and so I had more confidence. But there was a moment where once we finished, like once we signed the book deal, I actually had a full-blown anxiety attack that I actually thought I was having a heart attack, and it turned out that I was just having an anxiety attack.
That sounds scary.
No, it's weird. But
you said you looked for a new editor. Did you have someone in mind, or were you just waiting to see who would register interest and then take it from there?
I didn't have an individual person in mind, but I should say that I did continue to work with my Canadian publishing house, Knopf, so and my British publishing house, Allen Lane, but my primary editor was going to be with my U.S. house. I knew I didn't want to have too many cooks. One of the things that happens when you get published simultaneously in different countries is that you can have a bunch of editors, like in the document, like, and I've had this with other books where you have, are people interested in this level of granular? But I hate having editors arguing in front of me and track changes. I mean, it's happened to me before where it's just, first of all, I just hate track changes. I hate comments and track changes as a way of having a conversation about text. And when you have multiple people, it really is too many cooks. And so I also was very clear with this book that if it was going to kind of maintain a sort of the integrity of its voice, I needed one main editor and then people could read it afterwards. I wanted to be with FSG because it's the most sort of large literary house in the US. Sometimes when you're with like very big mainstream houses, they're really good at a certain kind of nonfiction, but I just wasn't sure that it was going to work for creative nonfiction. And FSG has the reputation for being the best literary nonfiction house in the US. They turned me down flat on no logo, and I was devastated when I was, 28 or whatever. And I always remember the rejection letter that I got from the FSG editor, which was very funny and literary, which was he wrote to my agent and said, "She's as smart as I think I am after 3 martinis." But, and then I don't think there's a market for this book, etc. So it was always kind of like a life goal to get back to FSG, and I'm always reminding them that they turned me down on no logo, and they're like, "Okay, yeah, we get it." So I did want to go with FSG, and I'd heard about this editor Alexander Starr from a friend whose writing I really admired, and so it was a very joyful moment when Alex sent this sort of like preemptive letter to my agent. I still have it like pasted above my desk, but yeah, Alex was a great companion.
And with the kind of research process, is it right that you tried to engage with Naomi Wolf but didn't get anything back? She wasn't going to engage with you.
Yeah, which was weird. I'm just going to pour some coffee, so if you hear a sound of it's early in the morning. All right. I was kind of surprised she didn't want to engage with me, honestly, because she would try to engage with me a lot over the years. So, this confusion with me and her and I is, it's been going on for 15 years or more. But there was a period where she seemed to be encouraging it. Like when I would write about, she had a conspiracy theory about the Green New Deal, which is, a way of approaching the climate crisis, where she thought it was all cooked up by hedge fund managers. And she had like this very tenuous sort of smoking gun claiming this. And so every time I would write about the Green New Deal, she would tag me on Twitter and be like, "Hey, Naomi, I don't think you understand this." And there had been other points too where she really wanted to engage with me. And my attitude at that point was like, just don't engage with this person. Like, this is not good. But I thought that on the pandemic, she would want to, because she was doing a lot of things that seemed to be about getting attention. And she had this new book coming out, which was a compendium of all of her COVID theories. And I wrote to her 3 different ways and went through a mutual friend and just heard kind of silence back. But then when I listened to some interviews with her, I sort of understood the extent to which she feels completely burned by, what she would characterize as, this, the mainstream liberal press. And so I think she didn't do any interviews for a long time. I don't know if people were trying, but she was only doing interviews with other conspiracy-friendly outlets, or very kind of religious outlets, or Steve Bannon. I think she found a new audience when she changed during the pandemic, and it's a huge audience. It's a bigger audience than she had before. And I think she probably just saw all downside of being with people who were going to challenge her. And it was clear that I was going to challenge her. I mean, I put that in writing, that I was going to, I promised it would be a cordial debate, but it would be a debate. So yeah, she never responded to any of that outreach.
And in terms of your other research for the book, I mean, you've mentioned Steve Bannon just then, and you listened to his podcast, for instance, as a useful touchstone. But how did you go about collecting the material that you needed for the deeper themes of your book, AI and conspiracies and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, this book is a more essayistic book than any of my previous ones, in that and while there's some reporting in terms of speaking to experts, and is a pandemic book in that I wasn't able to gallivant around and do the type of field research that I've done for books like This Changes Everything and The Shock Doctrine. A lot of this was just reading, reading a lot of other books, watching a lot of doppelganger films, reading theory about doppelgangers, doing lit reviews about psychoanalytic theories around why there is this perennial obsession with the double. So everything from Dostoevsky to Freud and Jung and Ursula Le Guin, and just sort of turning around on all of these themes. So it was in the same way that it was very different. I mean, that's the other thing about why I was able to keep this book secret, in a sense of, I couldn't do that for my more heavily reported books like The Shock Doctrine, because, for The Shock Doctrine, I traveled to Iraq and Sri Lanka and New Orleans, and, I had a team of, with this book, I did have a team of 3 researchers working with me. I work at the University of British Columbia, and I had 3 graduate research assistants who help me with lit reviews, but also help me with fact checking. This is the other thing with a lot of the way I work with researchers is just, I have my own fact check team. So I think because I've been when I wrote my first book, I was unknown author. I had a little bit of research help. I didn't really have a strong sense that anyone was going to care about this book. And then because that book sort of catapulted me to another level of scrutiny, I was lucky enough to be able to get book advances that allowed me to pay for my own fact checkers, because I was terrified. I was terrified of making mistakes that would not only hurt me, but hurt the movements that I'm a part of. And so that has tended to be how I pay for, I need the book advance to pay for my researchers. In this case, I sort of did it out of pocket before, but I also didn't have the level of expenses that I had for a heavily reported book, where I'm doing a whole bunch of research and travel, and it's going on for 5 years and things like that. Like, this was a lighter lift than any book before in terms of just cost. So I could just do it without telling anyone first.
So we wanted to come back to Doppelganger later, but could we roll back now to your early life? So your mother was a documentary filmmaker, your father was a doctor. You've described them as crunchy 60s radicals. Could you tell us about this Milo that you grew up in?
I must say, I do have some friends who really grew up in majorly hippie families that make my families look very bougie. It seemed really hippie to me compared to sort of I grew up in the 80s, and it was sort of somewhat of like a double-y life in that my home life was very different from my school life, because my parents weren't committed enough hippies to like raise me in a commune and send me to like alternative schools where everybody else's parents were hippies, right? They wanted us to have these like very particular values in our family that were very different than the dominant social values. But my mother also wanted me to go to Hebrew school, where the kids came from very, very conventional families. So I just always had this sense of like, there's something wrong with my family. Like, they're very, very different than everybody else's parents. Didn't have to be like that. They could have sent me to a weird school, but they didn't. So yeah, what was the milieu? I guess it was just very political, in that the whole reason that we lived in Canada is that my father was a war resister from the Vietnam War. So our whole sort of like story of our family had to do with politics. And then my father's father, he was an artist, an animator who was fired by Walt Disney for union organizing. So there was a lot of sort of stories in my family about things that happen if you have political beliefs. Like, you will have to leave your country, you will lose your job and never be able to work as an artist. But these were sort of stories that were interesting. Like, they were kind of exciting. It wasn't like they weren't stories that I was told to like scare me. I think it was exciting sort of as a kid to hear these stories. Not less so my grandfather was blacklisted. They were proud of these stories of like for instance, there's a story about when my grandfather helped organize the first strike at Walt Disney Studios in 1941 or 42. And my father was, I think, 3 years old. And my grandmother would always tell these stories about my father sitting on the back of this. My grandfather had a motorbike, and he would just scream scab, like the scabs that Walt Disney brought in. And that was like a really important story to my grandmother. My grandmother was very hardcore. She would sing this Yiddish song called Schmier de Guillotine, mit Blut, 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 which, is what it sounds like. And my grandparents were actual hippies. Like they before there was such a thing as hippies, they left New York, New Jersey, and they joined this commune called Nature Friends, which was in rural New Jersey, and it was, it's communist enough that it was under surveillance by the FBI, and they would have like Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie would come and perform, and I think they used to live in the actual sort of commune where people had their own little houses, and then they had all these sort of cultural activities and political activities. And then my grandfather's very, very capable, and he built this house down the road that was a really important part of our childhood. So that was a part of it. But then my dad studied to be a doctor, and then they moved to Canada, and that's where he did his residency. And my mom, as you said, was a documentary filmmaker. She was part of the first women's film studio, I think, in the world. Definitely, it was part of the National Film Board of Canada, where they realized that almost all their film directors were men, and that it was part of the feminist movement to win this victory of a women's film studio. So it was called Studio D, and they had these staff directors. I mean, it's kind of unheard of to think of now because there are no jobs like this. But my mom had a staff director job, and they would just pitch films, but they had their jobs. Then there was a whole bunch of them, and they were basically 70s consciousness raising films. They would make films on topics like disability, or abortion rights, or women in politics, or pornography, or women in peace, and they would all they take turns directing and producing each other's films. And they were movement tools. Like I have all of these memories of just like showing a film, having in the living room, and then there would be like crying and discussions, and it would like raise emotions, and it was really consciousness raising, like the documentary film, less as a kind of an art form and more as just the beginning of a conversation, right? Like a topic you've never heard of before. My mom directed a film called Speaking Our Piece. She produced a film that was directed by one of her friends, Terry Nash, called If You Love This Planet. And it was about the threat of nuclear war. And it intercut old Ronald Reagan film clips, when he was an actor in these World War II films with, that's my memory of it anyway. I think one of the films was called Bedtime for Bonzo, with a lecture of Helen Caldecott warning about the dangers of nuclear war. And that won an Academy Award. So that was very exciting. I think that was 1980.
You said you pushed against your mother's feminist ideas in adolescence. Was that just kind of typical teenage rebellion? And when did you kind of have another change of heart on feminism, so to speak?
I mean, I think I just came to understand that there were more kinds of feminism than my understanding of what feminism was according to my mom and her friends. And it was more a cultural, it was not a political clash in the sense of it wasn't their ideas that bothered me. It was more their affect, and it was more their sort of sense of style. And mainly because of this kind of culture clash that I'm describing of the home values, which were very sort of anti-consumerist, and what I described as sort of like crunchy. I mean, the whole aesthetic of my family sort of was frozen in the very early 1970s. And I was a child of the 1980s where everything was just getting glossy and shiny. And I associated, I guess, feminism with like a rejection of all of the aesthetics that I was interested in. And I felt very judged by it. But it wasn't like an argument that I was having about the nature of women's equality. It was more of a cultural, like, get that away from me. And so I think it was sort of inevitable that I would come back to it because I did always have a sort of strong sense of social justice as a kid. It's just that I was having a cultural clash with their particular brand of it.
And you mentioned that the Montreal massacre in 1989, when you were a student, was a kind of turning point. How did that have an impact on you?
Yeah, so what this was a mass shooting of the kind that we have seen many, many, many more of, but at the time was really a rupture. I mean, there had never been anything like this at certainly at a Canadian university. I'm not even sure there had been at an American university at that time. But so it wasn't my university. I'm from Montreal, but this was when I was in my first year at University of Toronto. So I just left home. And we got this shattering, it was massive and national rupture story where a shooter had gone to the engineering school at the University of Montreal. I think it was December 6th, 1989. And his name was Marc Lepin. He had applied to that school and not been admitted. He'd wanted to be an engineer, and they hadn't let him in. And this was the very beginning. I mean, the engineering schools had very few women at the time, and there was an attempt to diversify the schools. And he got it into his head that the reason he didn't get into this university program was because they were trying to have affirmative action. And so he was very, very angry at feminists. And he went to the university, it's called UQAM, University of Quebec à Montréal, and separated the men from the women and said, "You're all a bunch of fucking feminists," to the women, and shot 14 women dead. I think he shot more women, but he killed 14 women. So it was a hate crime. It was very, very, very clearly a hate crime. But the way it was reported was as like it was very strange. Like there were women who I knew who were friends with my mother who would go on our national broadcaster and say this was a hate crime, this was misogyny. And then the male hosts would tell them that they were wrong and that this was just a madman. This was not political. Why were they politicizing it? And we were just so upset listening to this and watching this. I remember in our dorm rooms that we organized a meeting to talk about the Montreal massacre. And I was asked to chair the meeting because people knew my mother was a feminist. And I was sort of put into a position of leadership just because I think I had skills that came naturally to me just because I grew up. Like I said, I grew up in rooms full of people crying about documentary films and organizing. And so I just realized I knew how to do this. And so I did.
And can we talk about your entry into the world of journalism? You were writing for your student newspaper and became editor-in-chief. But is it right that you briefly left university to take up a job at the Globe and Mail as well?
It's true that I didn't graduate university before I got a job. And I was in university for as long as it should have taken to get a degree, but I was constantly dropping classes to work at the student newspaper. So I was editor of my college newspaper at University College, and then I was features editor of the Varsity, and then I took the job of editor-in-chief, which is a job because it's a large university. So I think we were printing 25,000 copies twice a week at that time. So there were 3 jobs that were actually paid jobs that you had to drop classes to take. So I took a year off to edit the Varsity, and then that summer got an internship at the Globe and Mail, but then they hired me on because there was an election. So I had been planning to go back and finish, but it seemed more exciting to stay and help cover the election. I was on the copy desk. I wasn't a reporter, and then I got another job editing a magazine. So I did that for a while. And then I was like, why do I need a degree after? And then I decided to go back to finish the degree. And then I had the idea for No Logo. And then I dropped out again. And now I have tenure. So like I go to universities and they ask me for career advice. I'm like, I don't know, drop out. Worked for me. And then they tell me to leave.
Turning to No Logo now, your book, which focuses on branding and was this huge hit. Could you tell us how that came about, how the idea came to you, but also we really like on the podcast to hear about, particularly with authors' first books, how they went about finding a publisher and things like that. So take us back to that time.
So I was working as a journalist, like I'm discussing with you. So I had been writing, professionally starting while I was still in school. I would write for the student newspaper, but occasionally would have a big enough story about something going on campus that I would write it for a non-campus newspaper. I started writing pretty regularly for. We had an alt weekly in Toronto called Now Magazine, and I wrote a few features for them. Then I just started writing for magazines in Canada, and then I got a column in our largest newspaper in Canada, the Toronto Star. And I was there. I think I got it when I was 24, and I was sort of a token youth columnist, as I would refer to myself. It was there was a hiring freeze at a lot of the newspapers, and they wanted to make sure that they had a youth voice, and a few of us got these jobs as casualized labor. So my beat at the Toronto Star, and this would have been when I was like 24, 25, was pop and politics, I believe, was the kind of cut line for my column. So it was the intersection of politics and popular culture. That was, so I could write about anything I wanted under that kind of banner. And I wrote a lot about marketing. I wrote a lot about sort of alt marketing, kind of like co-optation of youth culture for marketing. This was a period where the first big kind of lifestyle brands were developing their brand identities. I mean, I would write about Cool Hunters. I wrote a lot of No Logo through these newspaper columns. And then when there was an idea, when I was writing something more reported, I would pitch it to a magazine. So, like, for instance, No Logo is it's about the rise of anti-corporate activism, largely among young people. So it covered everything from Reclaim the Streets to ad busting, or culture jamming, as we used to call it, to young people organizing their, what we used to call McJobs, with their fast food outlets, their fast fashion jobs. And so pretty much every part of No Logo I had written a feature article about, or a series of columns about. And so I was able to turn that book around fairly quickly because it represented like 5 years of journalism through my column in the Toronto Star and Canadian feature writing. And because I had a profile in Canada as a youth writer, it wasn't hard to get very little money to write a book about it in Canada. It was harder to do it in the US, as you heard my sob story about FSG turning me down. I was turned down by a lot of publishers. But I did, I was fortunate to find a publisher in the UK, Philip Gwyn Jones, who was then at HarperCollins. I think there was not a bidding war for No Logo in the UK. It was only Philip, I'm pretty sure. And it was just that so I used to write for the Baffler, or I had written for the Baffler, and Philip, who was only a few years older than me at this point, was like one of the few UK subscribers of the Baffler, and thought it was really cool. And he got No Logo, like, because that was the politics of the Baffler. They did a special issue called Commodify Your Dissent, or Accessorize Your Dissent, yeah. And so because Philip read the Baffler, he understood the premise of No Logo before it was written, when it was still on proposal. And yeah, we had one publisher in the US that was interested, I think offered like $10,000 or something like that. So it was not a bidding war. It was not lots of people. It was just like a few editors who were sort of paying enough attention to what was going on with youth culture that they were not entirely dismissive. I always remember, I was published by Knopf in Canada, and I got a meeting with Knopf US. My experience with trying to shop that book, I mean, if people are listening and are like, I think it's encouraging to know that a book that a lot of listeners probably don't remember, or they were very young when No Logo came out, but it was a phenomenon. It sold 1 million copies. It was translated into 35 languages, etc. But it was turned down by many, many, many publishers. I think a lot of the publishers understood there was something there, but they didn't have the courage to do it. So this would have been 1998 when I was shopping the book. And I had this weird experience now where a lot of editors, like top editors in New York, wanted to meet with me and tell me in person why they couldn't publish the book, which is I now understand to be weird. Like you would just send a letter, but it was more than that. They felt bad about it. And there was this one editor at Knopf who asked me to come in and explain to me. She said, "I want to publish this book. I love this book. This is what I want to do in publishing. But people really want to read memoirs of eating disorders. That's what they want." And then she gave me the galleys of a book that was indeed a memoir of an eating disorder. And I'm not saying that, it was probably a good book, but I was annoyed that she was telling me that this is really, if you're a young woman, you can really only write about yourself. And this book that's about politics and culture, no one would ever want it. And so, yeah, I hold on to these little grudges just because I don't think it's about me. I think it's the way gatekeepers behave, and that they wanted me to know that they got it, but other people would not get it. And that's why they couldn't do it. But what I realized now and later was that she was sort of saying, if you were Naomi Wolf and you were writing a book about beauty and unattainable beauty standards, we would publish that. But this book that is much more sort of conventionally about politics and trade and labor is not marketable, is not a book that people will want to read. So she was basically saying, you're the wrong Naomi, which I think is funny.
You have to hope things have changed since then. The book, as you've mentioned, became a huge bestseller, a big phenomenon. How did that change things for you when you were in your late 20s? I saw that there was a column in a newspaper in Canada called Klein Watch, where they would try and kind of spot you going into shops like Starbucks to kind of catch you out. Yeah.
They would try, but they would never catch me. Yeah, no, I think it was, I mean, look, it was such a lucky break, that book. And it came out, when I was writing about these trends, I think the reason why the book was turned down by so many publishers was that this politics wasn't really visible. It was barely getting covered, except in like journals like The Baffler. There was still a perception that this was a totally apolitical generation, the Gen X. And when the book was at the printer, they were the first of these large protests against, at the time, the World Trade Organization in Seattle. And it was a mass demonstration that seemed to come out of nowhere if you had not been paying any attention to these sort of percolating trends. But what was amazing about it from a writer's perspective, at least for me, because I'm not sure that all writers would see it this way, but the book was sort of predicting a movement, not exactly predicting, because it wasn't like I was a futurist. It was like there are all of these movements and they have these common themes. It was sort of, I often describe my work as pattern recognition, right? So even if those labor activists aren't self-identified with these culture jammers or Reclaim the Streets activists or campaigners against Shell in Nigeria and the decimation of the ecology there, this is clearly a shift towards going after corporations as opposed to governments, which used to be the main site of protest. It was sort of treating governments as if they were irrelevant and going directly for the people who are kind of paying off the politicians. But it wasn't self-understood as a movement. But it seemed inevitable to me that eventually it would coalesce into a movement. And that happened just as the book came out. And what that meant was that the book was sort of picked up by the movement, and then it kind of snowballed. And I was able to be part of this movement. And this is why I say I'm not sure all writers would feel comfortable with this. I mean, I think some people might have been uncomfortable because I was suddenly being invited to speak at rallies and things like this. And that wasn't who I was. I was a reporter. But I went along for the ride, and it was a really, I didn't have the skills to be that kind of a speaker, like the kind of speaker that I was being asked to be, like to speak at much more political events. But I got better at it. And the best part about publishing No Logo in that moment was, and as it came out in translation, was it was kind of like the backdoor key to every city. So I would go to a city I'd never been to, like Rome, and I would be greeted by a bunch of scruffy anarchists who would take me to a squat and ask me to speak and give me beer. And it was just like a great way to see the world, because it was just this kind of instant trust or instant community with people. And so I feel very lucky for all the things that No Logo opened up for me, and all the sort of movement friends that I made. And it was, but there was I guess a flip side to it, which was that not everyone loved this movement. It had enemies. It had opponents in the right-wing press. And because I was the most sort of visible part of it to them, and it was this very decentralized movement, it was very anti-leadership. So it wasn't like it was putting forth official spokespeople all the time. So a lot of the coverage just centered on me and a few other people who were easy to spot. And there was this gotcha culture of we're going to prove that Naomi Klein actually consumes logos or goes to these businesses that she's exposing and so on. And they didn't do that because I was incredibly careful. I mean, I didn't walk into a Starbucks for at least a decade. I remember a moment when I realized nobody cares anymore. You can get a coffee in an airport, and nobody, like, it's ancient history, but it made me very self-conscious and probably saved me a lot of money. But I did have an experience where the Vice guys, before they were a massive international conglomerate and before they tanked said international conglomerate, went through my garbage and photographed it to prove that I consumed logos. Yeah, they're Canadians. They had it out for me.
One thing we often find with authors who've had a very big success in any context or genre is that following it up can be challenging. So what was the experience of working out what you were going to do next like, and then how did that kind of lead towards the shock doctrine?
I think I realized about a year into the sort of whirlwind of No Logo, that if I wanted to, I could repeat myself for a long time, and that there were writers who did this, that there was sort of an endless number of invitations, and especially because it was a political moment, there were a lot of conferences happening and World Social Forums and all of these spaces where a roster of 10, 15 sort of experts on globalization were just constantly speaking and putting out versions of the same book. It felt like, I don't know, I just realized that it wasn't for me. Like, it wasn't for me to do that much talking, and that I was starting to get bored. I was repeating myself, and so I was kind of becoming a caricature of the thesis of No Logo. And I don't know, I just put a stop to it. I just stopped doing any speaking and just went back to reporting. And honestly, the shock doctrine just came out of a very similar process to No Logo. I was just reporting. I mean, okay, so shock doctrine comes out at the very beginning of 2000. And the other thing that happened was September 11th. And this sort of seismic political shift of the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that had a huge effect on the movements as well. And I just started writing about the invasion of Iraq, and I sort of developed a particular focus on not the war, but not the what of the war, but the why of the war. So what they wanted to do with Iraq after the shock and awe invasion. And what they wanted to do was sell it off and turn it into this neoliberal utopia that never materialized. But that was my beat on covering the post 9/11 landscape was this sort of economic dream world of the neocons in the Bush administration. So I went to Iraq, and that was another thing where it was sort of like I actually called the editor of Harper's from the airport, and said, I'm going to Iraq. And this was privilege. I mean, I had the money because of No Logo, where I didn't have to wait for a newspaper. I didn't have to wait for a newspaper or magazine editor to assign me. I self-assigned that I was going to cover the economic side of the war. And there were already like these edicts that the Viceroy of Iraq, Paul Bremer, appointed by George W. Bush, they were churning out these absurd edicts where, I think it was called Bill 9, was it called a bill? Order 39, that's my memory of it. And it was like, all Iraqi state companies will be privatized by X, and it was, or like that we will roll back, Saddam's labor protections, which actually weren't bad. And, because the war was still a hot war by this point, this was not getting nearly as much coverage as it should have. And so I just decided that I was going to do that and made some contacts with people there who were going to help me, and called the editor of Harper's from the airport and said, I'm going to write this feature. Do you want it? And he's like, yeah, I want it. So Shock Doctrine was a series of magazine articles before it was a book. I wrote, I also went to these, they would have these wild trade shows in Washington and, other places where it was like, come buy a piece of Iraq, buy a piece of the Reconstruction. And there would be like Halliburton and Bechtel and all these big companies where they were privatizing the reconstruction of Iraq. And it was, a huge profit center. And this was a shift. A lot of this had not previously been treated as, in the same kind of neoliberal, like it would have been the Red Cross. It wouldn't have been Blackwater that was coming in doing this. So that was a big shift during the Bush years, was the extent to which they privatized both war and reconstruction from war and just handed it out as contracts to their friends. So I was just doing this journalism. And then, it's always this point where it's like, this is bigger than an article. It's too big. And then it started to happen after natural disasters. And I wrote about that. I reported from Hurricane Katrina and the Asian tsunami. But at a certain point, I realized that this was really a kind of a booming new economy that I ended up calling disaster capitalism. But I had already written a cover story for The Nation called The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. So, I think it's just a point where it just gets too big for a magazine article. But a lot of the Shock Doctrine appeared as this cover story for Harper's.
So the Shock Doctrine was another big hit, and you've sort of touched on this in terms of No Logo, but it's a rule of the show that we always talk about money. So how did that pair of books change things for you? How did it kind of make your writing life easier?
I mean, No Logo was utterly life-changing, especially because it wasn't a book that I was paid very much money to write. And it was such a surprise that it became a bestseller. And so it made, this kind of freedom that I'm describing, like to be able to sort of self-assign for the Shock Doctrine, to be able to buy an international ticket and go to a war zone without anybody saying I could. I don't know what there is to learn from it. It's so rare for something like that to happen for a writer. I don't even feel like it's particularly helpful I don't have career advice. I don't know. Like, it was such a lucky break.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so a final question from me. You moved to writing about climate, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that, but in the context of activism versus journalism, what your feelings are between the distinctions between those two things and how one walks the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is another thing that I was, another kind of gift of No Logo, and I really do feel like it's given me a lot of gifts, is that because the publishing industry was wrong about No Logo, and, it's like all the big publishers that turned it down in the States and in the UK, it earned me a lot of trust when I would say I want to write a book about capitalism and the climate, and was saying that I would have, so that book came out in 2014, but I would have been shopping the proposal, in 2011. And, even something like at that point of like putting capitalism in the subtitle, that was not a good publishing decision, but people trusted me in a way that they wouldn't have. Like they would say, I don't think that's a good title, but you were right about that one, so maybe you're right about this one. So it got me a lot of freedom in that way. In terms of that distinction between writing and journalism, I'll bring it back to my mom and what I was that I had another model for what journalism could be, like what documentary could be, what nonfiction could be, from my mom, because she was making serious nonfiction documentary films that were completely embedded in the women's movement. And the head of Studio D, the head of this women's film studio that was kind of like all these amazing, now all these incredible women that I was fortunate enough to grow up with. The head of Studio D was this woman, Kathleen Shannon. And these films would be accused of not being objective, of being too activisty. And Kathleen would say, when all objectivity means is I object to your activity. And which is simply to say that, that you can have a positionality, you can have passions, you can believe in things. What you need to be is accurate. What you need to do is hold yourself to a high standard. And in fact, if you're going to go out on a limb, your standards need to be higher, because if you're just reiterating status quo opinions, nobody's going to comb through your garbage, by the way. They're going to leave you alone because you're not challenging anything. You're not a threat to anyone. But if you actually are going to challenge entrenched power, you need to work harder to make sure that your facts are right, and because you're going to come under scrutiny. So I think a lot of the people who kind of get dismissed as activists, hold themselves to a higher standard than a lot of people who imagine themselves to be, to not have politics simply because their politics are mainstream politics.
Well, that's a strong note to end on. Thank you so much, Naomi, for your time, and wishing you all the best with Doppelganger and all your projects going forward.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak with both of you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Naomi Klein. Her website is naomiklein.org. She's on Twitter at Naomi A. Klein, and Doppelganger is published by Alan Lane. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Naomi?
I thought it was very fortuitous timing, because we interviewed her literally a day or so before she won the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction, so that worked out very well. I was very interested to hear, as I always am, about how a massive global hit, in this case No Logo, came about and was received. I thought it was heartening, her mentioning about how all the Grand magazine editors who would ghost her beforehand then would call her up and ask her to do work for them. And I also thought that on the whole line between journalism and activism piece, she gave some quite thoughtful answers. What about you?
Yes, I really enjoyed the conversation. I agree with all of your points. I guess I was interested in some of the sort of minutiae of her process. Things, for instance, like fact-checking is now such a big part of what she does, because with this increased scrutiny has become, on her part, a greater sense of responsibility to get it all, absolutely spot on. So I found that interesting. And then likewise, the kind of mechanics of changing an editor and agent for this book in particular, which seems to have paid off. As you said, won the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction. So yeah. What have you been up to, Simon? I
was just going to add, that she was very willing to go into the kind of minutiae of book deals and stuff like that, which for someone with such a profile, I thought was very good. I have been beavering away, mostly on my book, but also setting up a whole bunch of interviews and going to archives and stuff in the Alps next month, which has been fine, but quite busy. And I have been reading again material for my book. So I'm reading a biography of Frank Smythe, who was a mountaineer in the 1930s, and it's nice to be reading stuff in English after having to read a lot of French. And I was doing some archival research at the Alpine Club and looking at letters and stuff like that. What about you, Rachel?
I have been enjoying some time off work, aforementioned puppy has arrived, but I'm going to use this week to do some watching for a piece I'm working on about fashion. There's various documentaries and drama series, including one called The New Look.
I was just going to ask if that was what it was.
Yes, that's one of them, but there's also a documentary about Diane von Furstenberg and John Galliano and various other people. So it's a week off, but a week that I'll be using hopefully productively.
Is The New Look in English or is it a French series?
I think it's in English, yeah. It was made for Apple TV. It's an American show, but yeah, set in France.
Very good. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.